As a trauma survivor, I have always been interested in resilience. But growing up, I believed it was something that you were born with. Then in graduate school, I learned that it was a quality that we all possess and a set of skills we can all strengthen. Most of my resilience has come from writing and seeing myself in new ways by confronting the stories I've always told myself. The more I did that, the stronger I became, and I've dedicated my life to helping others do this work. This podcast is for anyone who wants to understand their story and how to revise it, because when we do that work, we change the world. Welcome to Season 3 of the Writing Your Resilience podcast. I want to thank all of you who've been listening, and if this is your first episode, welcome aboard. I look forward to having you along for the ride. In seasons 1 and 2, I interviewed published writers and experts in the field of mental health so they could share their expertise and wisdom with all of us. I'll get back to that in season 4, but for season 3, which airs over the summer in the Northern Hemisphere, I'm launching my season of what I call summer shorts. These are shorter episodes where you'll get to hear from writers who are working in the trenches right alongside you. They'll share their fears, doubts, worries, and questions they have about the craft of writing and their writing lives. Think of it as your personal window into my coaching practice. But before we get to those episodes, I want you to hear from one more expert, Estelle Erasmus, author of Writing That Gets Noticed and host of the Freelance Writing Direct podcast. I met Estelle in 2017 at the Hippocamp Writing Conference. Since then, I followed her career, which has included stints as editor at Narratively and Writer's Digest. I've also read the viral essays she published in the New York Times and Washington Post. She also teaches for NYU's School of Professional Studies and does one-on-one coaching, among so many other things. To learn about all the things she's up to and her many awards, please see the show notes. During this episode, you'll benefit from Estelle's 3 decades in publishing as we talk about generating ideas, writing timely pieces, and dealing with rejection. But before we get to our interview, I have a few questions for you. How do you generate ideas for your projects? Have you tried to write something timely? What happened? How do you deal emotionally with rejection? And how do you decide what to make of the messages editors send to you? I hope you'll ponder these questions as you listen along. Now let's get to my conversation with Estelle Erasmus. Why, hello, Estelle. I am absolutely overjoyed to see you again and to have you on the podcast.
Thanks so much, Lisa. I love your podcast. I love listening to it. You have the best voice. You could do voiceovers.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Well, I cannot say enough good things about your podcast. When I was listening recently, I'm like, oh, Freelance Writing Direct. What? There's so much here. I mean, it was really each episode is like a masterclass, and there's so much there. So if you're listening to this podcast, you need to add Estelle's to your list. And there is one more thing that you need to do, and that is you need to buy your copy of Writing That Gets Noticed, which I love. You are so smart. You have it in the background. I've talked to a number of different writers about the marketing piece, and you got it all down.
Thank you. Yes, and that was one of the things. And I tell my writing students, if you have a book out, just get a placard made. You can go to Vistaprint. It's $25, $30, and there you go. It's set.
Well, I want to dive deeply into your book because I absolutely love it. Before I do that, what would you like us to know about your book and also about you?
Well, I've been in publishing for 3 decades on both sides of the publishing wall. I was a magazine editor-in-chief for 5 national consumer magazines called women's magazines back in the day. And then I launched magazines for publishers like the American Breast Cancer Guide, Esthétique, Wit, Women in Touch. And I started out at Woman's World magazine, which had, I believe at the time, something like 4 million newsstand circulation sales. So I honed my teeth at big and then smaller publications where I was editor-in-chief, which included, I was senior editor at American Woman, then I was editor-in-chief of Woman's Own, then I went to Hachette, and I did Body by Jake. And then after that, I went on to launch magazines. I wrote for over 150 publications, most of them print. I was there when print turned to digital. And then when blogging came into the field, and each time I pivoted, and in between, I dealt with my own personal struggles. I was single, the dating diva when I first started in publishing, and I would teach at the Learning Annex and the Seminar Center, and I wrote about it for a tiny love story for New York Times, where I've written a bunch of pieces for. And I ended up getting married in midlife, having my daughter in my 40s. She's 15 now, in a very pivotal age for her. But I kept changing with the times and growing and learning. And a lot of people who started the time I did are no longer in the field. And I'm still in the publishing field. I help people by teaching for NYU, for Writer's Digest, where I'm now a contributing editor. And I continue writing. And my book writing that gets noticed distills my 3 decades of experience on both sides. So as a well-published journalist and essayist, somebody who helps my students get published, and an assigning editor-in-chief who looked at information and looked at pitches and essays and determined if it was right for the publication. And I put all my tips and tricks and strategies and Estelle's Edge all throughout the book to help people be successful, because I wanted to be inspired like the way that I try to inspire people today.
That is a very wonderful description of you and your book. And let me just say, you have some major street cred when it comes to publication. And all of that shows up in your book. And there were so many things that I loved about the book. So I want to share just a few of my takeaways. Number one, it's very comprehensive. I felt like if I didn't know anything about publishing, I could take this book and it would help me publish a piece. If I know things about publishing, which by the way, I do, I learned new things, which is always exciting for me. I love it when I can learn something new. And I also like it when people package things well. And so even the things that I did know, you package them really well. I love your Estelle's Edge. The voice that you add to this piece makes me feel like you're sitting next to me, holding my hand, taking me through everything. And it's extremely accessible. And we can't talk about everything, but I want to give a shout out to some of those things, the checklists that you have in this. I think one checklist I have never, ever seen is the checklist of what to do when your work goes viral. That alone is worth it, beyond all of the other things in terms of the writing prompts and the different ways that you can generate new ideas. All of it felt comprehensive and it motivated me. I was like so excited as I was reading it, like, oh my gosh, I need to get started on this or that or the other. And I'm going to come back to this piece. So I love all of that about your book.
Thank you so much. That's exactly what I wanted to do. I focus, as all my students know who work with me either in NYU or Writer's Digest, or after I've worked with them, then I do smaller groups, Zoom sessions. My fall session is already sold out. I might do a winter one. But I focus on generating work and generating ideas and also getting published. Some people teach just how to get the ideas or
Yes.
just how to bring out the different writing voices. But the final piece for me is getting published. So that's bringing in the editor contacts, the information, the things that I can share with them based on my field and my connections and what I've done.
And you do it very well. And what I love about this is that you are helping me launch season 3 of my podcast. And I'm calling this the season of summer shorts. And so a good portion of this is going to be questions that people are asking me. But I have taught in the summer in the past. I was teaching this year-long memoir class. And what I have found is that, winter and spring, people are really motivated. They can dive deeply into a project. And then summer, is a free for all. And, I just want to acknowledge that some of my listeners are actually down under in Australia and places in the Southern Hemisphere. So, for you guys, you may be ready to dive in, or maybe you've been diving deeply into projects for a while and it's time to work on short pieces. And so I didn't send you this question because I always send everyone questions. But, if you're thinking about summer, what makes this a good time to work on short pieces?
First of all, any time is a good time to work on short pieces. I'm a big believer that something has to inspire you,
Yes.
because when people tell me their ideas, and we do an idea generation exercise for my students, and in the book, I talk about multiple ways to do that, including mapping your life for ideas, which is a mapping template that you put together that breaks down you, your interests, and then you can kind of see and connect it to what's going on in the news or what's going on in the zeitgeist. So, for example, if you're somebody who has climbed Mount Kilimanjaro, I'm giving a very extreme example, and then somebody is doing that in the news, perhaps a celebrity, it doesn't have to be a celebrity, but maybe then you can take and put together an essay idea and tie it around that. You can also do it around holidays. You can do it, maybe one of my students was a professional ice skater, and then she wrote something and we aimed it to be around the time of the Olympics. So she was able to make that tie-in. So I think that anything that resonates, if you're writing a couple of ideas down, whatever gets you excited. I'm really a big believer, as I know you are, Lisa, in like getting in touch with your body. What does it feel like when something feels exciting? I know when there's something I want to write about. When I wanted to write about how to bulletproof your child for the New York Times, the impetus was an example where my daughter had been bullied when she was 6 years old that I'd always kept in the back of my head, plus my own personal example being bullied and role playing that a guidance counselor told me to do. And so I knew to find an expert who did that. And I brought that plus other experts, plus my daughter's example in how I framed the pitch, and then how I ultimately wrote the story, which went viral for the New York Times in 2019. And that was how to bully-proof your child. But I knew I wanted to write about it. It got me excited. And I'm a big believer we don't do anything unless we're excited by it, because then you're going to put your full 110% into it. So if you want to start writing stories, I recommend, and I have in my book How to Do It, setting up Google Alerts. The reason I learned about Google Alerts is when I would interview in a journalistic way people for reported pieces that I was writing, even if they were hybrid and were framed around one of my anecdotes or somebody else's, they would tell me if they were writing a book, like neuroscientists and different people, that they had Google alerts on the topic of their book, because then they can get the latest studies, the latest research, the latest anecdotes, other books that are coming out, other stories, which just helps the brain generate and come up with other ideas. So I started doing that for myself. And at any time, I have about 20 Google alerts going on. I also use Chat GTP occasionally for that idea generation. I am not, and I don't recommend anyone do, put their unpublished work into Chat GTP or one of the AI chats or services, because then you're training the next generation of AI and or writers, and you don't want to do that. But for idea generation, it's wonderful. So we go with what resonates. So you set up a Google alert. Let's say you want to write about happiness, right? So you would say new studies about happiness, stories about happiness, 2024 and happiness. You just throw a bunch of different terms into your Google alerts. You can set it up for getting it daily or getting it once a week, or however you want to set up the timing. And this just gets your brain thinking, and then you go and you forget about it. But sometimes you'll see something and it'll make you think. It might be as random as a new game about happiness came
Mhm.
out. And you're like, wow. And then you go to the website about that new game. And lo and behold, they have a whole section on research on happiness. And there you're running. And there, obviously, you have to vet everything. And in my book, I have a whole section on data and resources to make sure that you're using credible sources. And I think I give
Mhm.
over 150 websites that you can go in every area, psychology, medical, because if you're writing and you're using a resource that's not credible, you're just getting the first thing comes up on Google when you're Googling, that might not be right. It might be a proprietary medical site. So you're taking information, but they're just with one drug. So that could be a problem when you're writing something. So you want to make sure that you're using the right research, the right information. But that idea generation part is great. And then don't put too much pressure on yourself. I always recommend you just go ahead and put your ideas down. And I'm a big proponent of journaling. I don't do it as much as I want to, but I think a lot of people, and I talk about it in the book, get journaling wrong. They write journal, like when I would go back to my 16-year-old journal, I was like, I went bowling with dad today. We had fun. I used the great bowling ball. You don't want to write a journal like that because that's just the external. You want to write a journal saying, went to the park today, had a great time. Seeing the birds reminded me of the last time I saw grandma before she went into hospice. What are
Mhm.
you doing? You're adding in emotion. You're adding in more than just the diary entry and the external. So you're building the heft of the emotional weight. And that is what you want. So when you journal, write snippets of dialogue, write how you felt, write your musings on a situation. I'm not in favor of essays that are full of musings and
Mhm.
just musings. You also have to have scenes. But if you're using journaling as a way to get your story ideas out and get them out, you can write those scenes and use what I call sensual language, which is sensory language, sight, touch, smell, taste. What does that do? Studies show that it brings a story to life for the reader and activates parts in the reader's brain that makes them want to read more and gets their attention, gets them
Yes,
noticed.
absolutely. And so I just want to reiterate a few points. And first, I'm just going to say, oh my goodness, when I look at my journals from when I'm 16, I'm like, why couldn't you have been a little more descriptive? And so, yes, if you can be descriptive, that is really helpful. And I can imagine someone doing that mapping exercise on the beach or just, on a winter day, you're sitting down, you're doing this just so that you're beginning to develop the field of awareness around the things you could possibly write about. Then you use the Google alerts again to build that field further to say, oh, what's coming on out there? And then you wait for that moment of inspiration. And I know exactly what you're talking about because there are times when I'll try to write from my head. I'm like, oh, I haven't had a piece published in a while. I should probably write about blah, blah, blah. And, that generally doesn't go very far. But recently, I was awakened at 3 o'clock in the morning by this thing. It was like, you must say this. And so, I mean, that's exactly how it was. And so, I woke up the next day, I still had that same feeling. And I was like, okay, this is a little vulnerable, which is one of the things we're going to talk about next. But I knew that I could write about it and I did, and then I sold it. And so it's going to come out. It's under contract right now and it's going to come out in a little while, but it was that passion piece. And I can say that every single piece that I have published has started with passion. So passion is the number one thing you have to have because that will show through in your writing. But we want to make sure that as we're thinking about passion, we really understand the difference between vulnerability and pity. And I think this is such an important topic because a lot of people who listen to this podcast are trauma survivors. I'm a trauma survivor myself. And sometimes the brain can equate vulnerability with trauma or with things that have a high emotion. And that's not necessarily passion. That might be things that belong in therapy, right?
Yes.
So just because an emotion is high doesn't mean it's time to write about it. So you actually have a piece in your book where you talk about, it's like a headline, vulnerability versus pity. Can you talk about what you mean by that? And let's go down that rabbit hole.
Sure. So it's important to connect with the reader.
Yeah.
And the way you do that is not by showing your perfection. I'm great, I'm wonderful, everything goes well for me. That's really kind of being brittle, and that's not allowing them room in. But you show your vulnerability. You show that through scenes. You show that through clues to your character of how you handle something and how you show your voice on the page. So I gave a couple of examples, and I want to give an example of a situation that comes up a lot, and that is when someone is ranting.
Mm.
So somebody's saying, I want to write an essay, and they are just pulling this out of air, ranting about their landlord. And it's all the things that the landlord has done wrong. Well, first of all, a personal essay, there has to be an I in there. There
Yes.
has to be the person. I say to so many of my students, where are you? Where are you in the essay? We need to see your feelings, your thoughts, your reactions. And so if somebody's ranting, and it could be even as personal as their mother, how horrible the mother is, but you don't see them, you don't see the reaction. And I'm saying to them, you're going on and on about these things your mother said to you. And I want to relate to you, but if you're not showing a reaction and you're not showing some insight, and you're not showing some sort of narrative arc from you start, remember, it's personal, it's you start in a place in the beginning, there's an arc where your mother is still a part of it, but it's her effect on you. And then you end where you are transformed in some way. And in my book, I have several sections on personal essays, including analyzing a modern love essay by Bill Dameron, analyzing other essays from Salon and from Bloomberg, and really saying what works and what resonates. And what really makes sense is to kind of end, I call it end with a gift for the reader, which shows a transformation that has taken place. And also circling back, which is a technique I talk about how to do in my book. And effectively, it's pulling something from the beginning, because as people, as readers, we want to feel like a sense of closure at the end of the essay. So you pull something from the beginning into the ending, and then that will kind of help you end it rather than end it flat. And that's what happened. Or like we learned in grade school, re-summarizing. And so that's why my mother annoyed me and why I've decided to break ties. No, that doesn't work. So there has to be a craft in essay writing. And the vulnerability comes in showing your reaction to a situation, your voice on the page. And when I say voice on the page, I believe that people have a basic voice. It's sort of like singing. I studied opera for years. Rihanna has, you hear one note and you know it's her. You know it's Barbara Streisand, Kelly Clarkson. It's the same thing with a voice. My voice is somewhat dramatic, but inspirational, and can be funny depending on the situation. But there are different tones to voices, but I don't believe that everyone has many different voices. I believe that your voice on the page is what you want to come through. And I talk about how to find that voice by giving examples of several students of mine and people that I've worked with when I guest edited narratively, and how I brought out and helped them bring out their voices on the page, whether it was funny or inspirational. So pitiful is like saying, oh, pity me. I'm poor. I'm bullied, but without any kind of insight into who you are. So, for example, showing vulnerability is, I've been bullied. This is what happened to me. This is how I reacted because I grew up hearing, making this up, my dad yell, this is not my story, my dad yell at my sister in the other room, you're this, you're stupid, right? And hearing the boy call me an idiot brought me back to that feeling.
Yeah.
Okay, now you're not just somebody the reader feels sorry for, because there's a universality to this. The reader thinks, okay, I've been bullied in my life, maybe not as extreme as this situation, but I can relate. And the person is sharing something about themselves and sharing a scene. And remember what I said, using that description and that detail. I always say God is in the details, brings a story to life. You don't want to just say, he picked me up in his car. You want to say, he picked me up in his Porsche with the steering wheel shined to, like where you could see a reflection in it because he buffed it every day with a cloth he kept under the seat, something like that. Obviously, I would edit that sentence, but the idea is that shows much more about the person and the clue to the character by showing the description and the detail. So other ways showing that somebody is just saying like, feel bad for me, is not showing any growth in the character, in how they're relating to the situation that's happening. So you want to keep having that. I always say, after every sentence in an essay, ask yourself, so what? The
Yes.
so what is what will move the story forward for the reader. And if it's not moving the story forward, scrap it, take it out, put it somewhere else, hold it. And that includes dialogue, that includes anything. And a lot of times when people are writing, they're writing almost, and I could tell this is the mark of an amateur writer who just needs to build and learn craft, because I do believe you can learn craft and learn a way of putting your voice out there on the page. The other thing I want to mention about being vulnerable and being pitiful, and the difference between the two, is the idea of oversharing. You don't want to overshare every single detail, because that will bog down the reader in too much of your emotion. And in a way, you need to be ruthless with your own emotion when you are conveying it in the written word. So again, does it need to be in the story? Does every aspect need to be in the story? And I am a huge advocate of having someone that is very close to you, whether it's a good friend or family member, to vet these very personal stories. And I've done that when I used to write a lot of parenting pieces about my daughter. And most recently, I wrote one for Shondaland about my hearing loss and how that affected my relationship with my now teen daughter. And so I had my husband read it beforehand, and he had a few sentences. He was like, I don't think you need this, like it's enough. You already have enough stuff. And my daughter read it, and she had a question about one sentence, and other stuff that I thought she might have a problem with, she allowed. And so I felt okay. I felt like I showed my vulnerability for sure, because I showed how it affected me when she reacted in a teenage way to me struggling with hearing. And it showed her accommodation to what I figured out after yelling and losing my temper and being, frustrated and feeling very upset, and how I kind of just marshaled my resources in a way that I would like my daughter to learn this type of resilience. And so I think that that showed vulnerability, but it wasn't like, "Oh, you poor thing. I feel sorry for you. You have this disability and you're just sitting with it and not doing anything." So I think showing a momentum and a
Mhm.
movement with whatever the issue, whether it's one of my students talked about, Selena Giovanni talked about, growing up poor,
Mhm.
and gave the scenarios of how that worked with their family and then how they got out of it. And she'd also written a piece about, I think, having a ghost in the house. And Ivy Eisenberg wrote this wonderful piece for Narratively about how she created a Yiddish fortune cookie company when she was working in IT and thought it was the greatest thing ever. And it just left her coworkers cold because they didn't understand the meanings of this. And she wrote it in a way that you're kind of laughing a little at her, but mostly with her.
Mhm.
And so it's setting it up in a way that you're not the victim. You
Yes.
may have moments of being the victim, but there is a way out. You're showing a way out. Otherwise, it's just like a, a rant.
Yeah.
You don't want to throw your, I always say, rage on the page.
Absolutely. I mean, you can throw your rage on the page. Don't send it to an editor ever, right? That's the important thing
Yes.
is don't send it to an editor. And, your essays, I'm going to take the essay on bullying and the one on hearing loss and put them in the show notes so people can read them and get a sense of what your writing voice is like. But yeah, you had so many great points that you were making around your piece needs to have a point. It needs to be about you. We need to see this arc of transformation that happens inside you. You start in one place and then you end somewhere else. And along the way, we're learning about you through the specificity of your writing, but you're not oversharing. And one of the things that I've actually learned is that if you want the reader to feel, pull back on your own emotions on the page. Like we don't need to have as much. And some things I would also say about vulnerability and how do you have that litmus test? Because then I'm going to ask you if there was a specific, moment like when you were editing for Narratively that comes to mind of like, this is what it looks like on the page. For me, I always think about what Megan Dahlm said about confessing versus confiding. So some of it is about, is there a rant on the page? Are your other characters bad and you're all good? Or, is there too much emotion? But sometimes it's about intention and about where you feel it. So if you are confessing, you are probably adding all of your own emotions. There's probably a rant, but your intention is for the reader to see, you and to get you, and you're asking them to do something to make you feel better. When you are confiding, you know what the story is, you know what the point is that you're trying to make. And yes, you're letting the reader into your world, but you don't need anything from them. You are being of service to them. So I think those are two things that are different. And then also, here's where I feel it in my body. If I'm feeling that confessy thing, like, oh, I just need someone to understand me, which is stuff that probably belongs in my therapist office, I'll feel it right here. I'll just have this like this feeling of like, oh, it's right here. And I have all this emotion around it. When it's ready for a public audience, I feel it more near my solar plexus. There is this sense that a foundation is below me that is helping me write the story because I know what it is.
Yes, there's a certain amount of trust that you have to have in yourself, in your own, SOS system within your body and yourself. And so one of the things I always recommend is print out your work and read it out loud, because not only will you find the clunky sentences,
Yeah.
but it's a great way to do that kind of check-in that you mentioned.
Mhm.
and see what is coming up for you.
Yeah.
And I don't do a lot of body work. I'm not a yoga person, but I'm a big believer in using the breath
Hmm.
to, feel and get in touch with the body. And I'm a big believer in finding that meditative time to kind
Yeah.
of go within, even if it's 5 minutes, just when I get up in the morning and I know I have a huge list of things to do, like this time of year where
Mhm.
my daughter is finishing school and getting ready for camp, and then we're going away. So it's a whole busy, busy time. I kind of just check in with myself in the morning. I do a quick little check in, like, how am I feeling? What do I want to accomplish? And I'm also a big believer in creating lists, for funny enough, and not just lists of what I have to do. I do accomplishment lists. If I write something, like I will say sent thank you note to this one, taped podcast with Lisa, wrote ideas for memoir scenes. And I don't know, it just sort of like I can release it and I can
Hmm.
know that I'm doing something good for myself. And I think feeling good about yourself is a great entryway to being able to write in a vulnerable way, because you're not doing it from a deficit. You're doing it
Yes.
from a plus.
I love that. You are not doing it from a deficit because you are caring for yourself and you are allowing yourself to feel good. Such great advice. So, we have talked about passion and the importance of it, how to generate ideas. And there are two places that I think writers have sticking points that I want to talk with you about briefly. And one of those is the timely essay. I think especially people who are working on book length projects, they feel this pressure to not just publish, but to publish things that are timely. And let's face it, if you have a timely angle, something is happening in the news and your work can intersect with it in some way, it's got a higher chance of being published if you've, done all of your due diligence, but also of becoming viral, right? Because it's part of the zeitgeist. And yet, some people will have great passion, but they struggle to find their point. Like they can't move as fast as the news cycle moves, which, oh my gosh, it's like you blink an eye and the story's over, right? It's not relevant anymore. So what advice do you have if you're a slow processor?
Yeah, I would say if you have any kind of a connection to anybody in the media or celebrity world, and I hate to focus it just on celebrities because it's not about that, but let's say, I'm just making this up, but Lady Gaga used to go into your dad's restaurant all the time and occasionally play for people, right? That is something that you could probably figure out an angle about. Now, maybe you don't have that yet, but maybe she's going to start a restaurant with her partner.
Mhm.
There you go. There, and if you're setting up your Google alerts and I'm going to give you an example of this. So I always loved Penny Marshall, Laverne, for Laverne and
Yes.
Shirley. And she died in 2018. And I quickly wrote an essay, but it wasn't quick enough, right? The news cycle moves so fast. But I wrote an essay about how impactful she was on my life. I was kind of like this, I was a little bit shy or insecure. I was also chesty like she was, but she had chutzpah. And I learned from that and I kind of transformed my life as I got older. So I wrote this essay, but it was too late, right? I sent it to a few
Mhm.
places and they were like, no, it's great, but it's too late. We already have something on her. So I held it and I didn't send the whole essay, I sent the pitch. And I set up a Google alert on Penny Marshall and everything about her, whether it's, Penny Marshall and movies, Penny Marshall and Big, Penny Marshall and A League of Their Own, Penny Marshall and books, Penny Marshall and eulogy, just anything. And in 2021, which is 3 years later, I received one of my Google alerts, and I just was so used to looking at them going, no, 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 it's not going to work. And it said A League of Their Own is coming to Amazon Prime as a series. And I said, bingo, that's my in. And so I pitched an editor at the AARP's The Ethel, huge circulation.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, A League of Their Own is coming to Amazon Prime this coming summer. Wasn't even out really in the news yet, but I'd gotten this Google alert. And I said, and I have a story about her impact on me. And she was the first to do $100 million movie and all that. And she said, yeah, if you can write it in such a way that it shows her, how her effect on you. And I already had it. And I said, absolutely. And I submitted it and it ran. So that was 4 years after she died.
Yeah, I love that strategy of writing it when it comes to you. And even if it doesn't get picked up now, you never know when it's going to be timely at another time. And so those Google alerts can be so helpful. And here's something I would say about movies, because I know last year the Barbie movie came out and then everyone wanted to write about Barbie and it was too late. Right. So the movie had already come out. And I think that one may have had maybe a 2 week time frame. Movies I've heard, it's like it comes out 3 days later, we're done. So if you know that a movie is going to come out and you've gotten your Google alert, like you're a fan of, I don't know, let's say Marvel movies, just as an example, and you know the next Marvel movie is going to come out, start writing down what you think about Marvel movies. The first time you saw a Marvel movie, the best experience you had with Marvel movies. Get all of these ideas down so that you can pitch something in advance, maybe of it, or let's say you go see it on the day of and you have this great connection point. You immediately get out of the theater and you pitch because now you have an essay that you can write very quickly.
Yes. And the other thing I would say is micro memoir is such a booming area.
Yes.
And a lot of my students have gotten tiny love stories in the New York Times, and that's an entryway to agents and to people who
Mhm.
are interested in their work. And you could take a larger piece that you had been working on, or maybe even part of your memoir in progress, and you can actually craft that into 200 words or less. For Tiny Love Story, it's 100 words. And I do want to make an offer, like if people want to follow my Substack at estelleerasmus.substack.com, where I give craft and writing advice, and email me at freelancewritingdirect@gmail.com. I will send you a huge list that I have compiled of places that take micro memoir. And a lot of these places also submit to pushcart prizes and other literary awards. So it's a great way to get yourself in the door and to get your work out there. And it's very motivating as well. One of my students just got in the New York Times from a piece that she worked on in a workshop with me at the Irma Bombeck Writers Conference recently.
Nice. Yeah, that is a great resource. And the link to your Substack will also be in the show notes. So definitely get access to that because the more you can get, the better you're going to be able to handle all of the publishing pieces. And so we have talked about what to do with timely stuff. Now I want to talk about the last part. And maybe not the victory of you got accepted, but what do you do with these rejections? Because you're a veteran. You've been in this field for so long. And it's not just about your experience, it's about the fact that you have overcome the rejections, right? You know how to deal with them. And that is a huge part of it. If you want to be a successful writer, learn how to deal with rejection. But sometimes it's also about not just the inner work of learning how to deal with rejection, it's about learning how to decipher what in the world these rejections mean. So, what advice do you have for people if they are getting a lot of rejections? How are they supposed to deal with that?
First of all, if you're a writer, rejection is part of life. It's like being
Yes.
an actress, which I once wanted to be. And you have to expect it. You have to have a bit of a thick skin. Back when I was doing more pitching or more cold pitching, I would sometimes revamp a piece or the beginning of the piece 30 times to fit a different place that it would be in.
Yeah.
For example, I had written a piece about me and my husband and how I broke my fifth metatarsal, and we went to meet his family for the first time, and I was strung out on Percocet.
Okay.
And at first I just had it as a straightforward relationship story, and it wasn't going anywhere. And then an editor was handling beauty at Yahoo, looking for stories that had a beauty angle. And so I gave it a beauty focus. I said, I was a beauty editor, but I looked pretty unkempt, by the time I had had my fifth metatarsal and I was taking Percocet and I was on the plane, a 24-hour plane ride to go to New Zealand, where my husband's family lived at the time. And then they moved to Australia, where you have a lot of clients. And so I made sure to put that beauty stuff in there. And that got accepted. But you have to be flexible. You have to think, okay, I'm going to try different things. If you have the time, if you have the impetus, if you really want to get a story out there. And in terms of rejection, you're going to get rejected, right? And a lot of times, sometimes they won't even respond, right? They will ghost you. And so if an editor ghosts you, you try a couple of times to get to the editor, right? Because it could be, people, sometimes they have huge inboxes. I mean, I know I do. My inbox is crazy. And maybe that was one cycle, they missed yours. So I would vary the time you sent it. I talk about some tactics in the book about that, but one of the things you can do is take the subject line and just take out the forward and just make it seem like you're sending it again for the first time. And then it's like, they're not going to feel, oh God, I didn't respond, I'll feel bad. It's just, you're trying it again. And sometimes I have success, and my students have success with that. Other times you can do things like, if they are responding and they're using a lot of superlatives, this is great, I really enjoyed reading it. Most editors, they're constrained by legal. They can't use a lot of superlatives. They can't be you're fantastic, because who knows how that person will react. So if they are using real high praise, that is an in. And so I would follow up pretty quickly with another really good idea, a pitch. And if you're sending an essay, some of them, they don't want your whole essay to be sent in the body of an email or even in the email. So I would do what I talk about in the book called Write to the Reader, which is part of my 352 pages of tips, tricks, strategies, Estelle's Edge. And writing to the reader is basically just writing the first part of the pitch as if it were the essay that the editor, who doesn't know you possibly from a hole in the wall, is going to read and go, ooh, I like their voice, or ooh, I like how they're setting it up and getting right into the inciting incident. You don't have to give the whole essay, but that will often work to pique their interest and make them want to know more. That's with the superlative stuff. If somebody is just saying, we have something similar to it, that's on you, right? Because if they say we have something similar that just ran, that's definitely on you. You should have done your research. All you have to do is go to the site or go to the magazine and do a search for your subject. And, if you want to write for a print publication, you should be getting that publication so that you know it. And online, it's very easy to search for your topic. And then, of course, have a hook. Everyone wants to write about love. Everyone wants to write about grief. Everyone wants to write about addiction. Everyone wants to write about loss. Everyone wants to write about trauma. But what's the hook? What's the focus that is going to differentiate you and make you stand out? And that could be a narrow focus, but also something that shows that it's a bigger issue for more people. And so, for
Yes.
example, if you're writing what I call a hybrid essay, sometimes called a reported essay, you're going to get a poll or a statistic or a fact in there. And again, you can put that in the pitch. And I have a whole section in the book on how to pitch. And I break down a lot of pitches that I did, not only for when I wrote the All About the Pitch column for Writer's Digest, I break down and analyze. And if you're a therapist, I'm big on analyzing writing to see what works and what doesn't and why. And the other thing is, if somebody has said, I love the great idea, but it's just not right for us at this time. What I would do is you keep sending it out.
Yeah.
And when you get a publication, I would send it to that editor, say, hey, it was great. Thank you so much for responding. Wanted to share that this was published. And here's my next idea. And the more credible and the higher level the publication, and you're showing it in a very casual, not like na boo boo. You're just saying, hey, wanted to share this with you. And they're now thinking, the editor, ooh, I missed that one. And then they're thinking, well, let me pay attention to this. And that, in fact, is what I did. I had submitted a piece to QZ Quartz a number of years ago, and the editor didn't respond. And in the meantime, I had it published in the Washington Post. When the publication came out from the Washington Post, I sent it to several editors that I had ignored the idea with a very nice email just saying, hey, just wanted to, call, show you this came out. And it's also the homepage section and, whatever laudatory thing I can put in there. And then I said, and by the way, I compliment something that they had in their recent issue. And then I would put in another idea. And that's how I got additional assignments. I got an assignment for Quartz out of that because he liked my idea. I got another assignment from another publication. And so you can keep that going. So rejection is kind of like making lemonade out of lemons, right? And everything, I believe it's really just how you approach it and how you look at it. One of the things that I do think is, you can acknowledge to yourself, you're feeling bad, you're feeling dejected. And as I say in my book, have a pity party for one, do what you need to do.
Yeah.
For me, I watch bad reality TV. I love Bravo, sorry, Bravo, but I watch that because their problems are always worse than mine. Their cat fights, their divorces and all that stuff is just entertaining, but I also feel bad for them. And then I feel better for myself and just realize it's a long game.
Yes.
You are in that marathon. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon. And so anytime, this is part of my inspirational part, anytime you say to yourself, this one's, doing better than me, this one's in this publication, you just have to realize that you're in competition with yourself. Yourself is the competition. Other people can spur you on and motivate you, but your only competition is yourself. And so you look at yourself and you say, what can I do to get incrementally taking steps to get to the goal that I want? And then you do it.
Absolutely. And what I would say is for all of the people that are on social media showing all of the awards or all of the great things, you have no idea what it took to get there and the number of doubts and the number of rejections that they have had to have the pity party for one for. So, yes. But when you do see that, say, oh, I want what they're having. Look and see what they're doing. Really pay attention and be curious. That's another thing you can do. And you know what, Estelle, we could be here for, I don't know, a week or more talking about this because there's so much in this book. It's so rich. I just want to tell everyone, go get their copy because it's going to help you get published. I can guarantee it because I've seen all of the stuff in here. I know a lot about this myself and I'm like, yep. It's so accessible. I always like to end with 3 lightning round questions that I ask everyone. First one is, what is the best piece of writing advice you have ever received?
Okay, I've received a lot of writing advice for the podcast, the people that I talk to. And I'm going to say one of the most recent ones was a very interesting piece of advice from Amanda Churchill, who
Mm,
wrote her debut novel, The Turtle House, which is HarperCollins. And she said when she struggles with writing, she writes a separate document all about her struggle.
I love it.
I love that. And that is something that I absolutely plan to do. Another thing, I'm going to throw in another one just for good
It's
measure,
always
because
good to have a little
service
bonus.
oriented if anything. Anne Hood, who's guests on my program,
Yes.
told me that she's a volcano writer. And that resonated with me because I always heard from so many people, write every day, write, you have to write 365 pages, a year to have a book. And for me, I'm sorry, I'm a mom of a teenager, I'm a wife, I have a lot going on. I teach for NYU and Writer's Digest and 101, and do plenty of seminars and webinars, and I can't write every day.
Yeah.
But Anne said, look at what you've written and maybe touch it or just look at it in some way or
Mhm.
think about it. And then when you're ready, because the brain is always working overtime. So that, and I am a proud volcano writer.
I love that. I think I'm kind of a volcano writer myself because, like you, when you're really busy, that is just a myth that you can write every day. It does not always happen, and you need to understand what your flow is. And I absolutely love Ann Hood. One of my favorite things she did is this podcast for Tin House, which is how to write a kick ass essay, which I will also add to the show notes because everybody should listen to that. So these are great tips, and I hope everyone takes that in. What do you do to nurture your resilience, especially since you have so much on your plate?
One thing I do is I remind myself of the good stuff happening, right? And that's not just to be like, oh, patting myself on the back, but
Mhm.
it keeps me in an elevated energy, right? It keeps me feeling, okay, there is momentum going. And I'm a
Yes.
very much a momentum like oriented person, but I definitely need the downtime too. For example,
Mhm.
recently Poets and Writers magazine named my book one of the best books for writers. And they did in their newsletter, Time Is Now, they highlighted my book as a book of the week, the nonfiction book of the week. So that was just, I was so honored by that. So, you have to remember these things because people put
Yes.
little things on social media and then you forget it. So I think reminding yourself of that. The other thing I do is, people say to me, and I laugh because they say, Estelle, you're everywhere. In fact, Lisa, I usually shut down over the weekend.
Mhm.
All my students know I don't work on the weekends on student work
Mhm.
or, any kind of public interaction or interviews or anything like that. And I'm very clear about it. Like I have it in my notes when I start with students. And so I get that breath. And what I do start doing even more so is I will do an out of office email. I'll say,
Mhm.
it's summer now and I'm away for the weekend. And I use it to actually put links into the things that I want to promote. So I'll
Yes,
say,
that is
have you
very
seen the
smart.
latest episode? Have you bought my book? I'll be returning anything that's not urgent later next week. And so that gives me the breathing room. It's like I don't have to respond, but I can if I want.
Mhm.
It is an urgent situation. And so that makes a difference. And my family knows, and I will tell you, when and I talk about it in the book, when I wanted to get back into magazines and writing after a long hiatus, nobody knew who I was anymore. Nobody. And I had gone into medical education. And I came back through blogging, through the bloggers.
Mhm.
They were the ones I auditioned for Listen to Your Mother with the wonderful Anne Imig, who helmed that whole kind of like a moth for mothers. And
Mhm.
I was in the inaugural New York performance of Listen to Your Mother in 2011. And so the bloggers were the ones who were doing social media. They were the first to know how to marshal that and do that. And they were very big with writing about their kids and writing about their feelings.
Mhm.
And most of them have gone on to writing for publications, writing books. And so it was a great way to build connections and build in a sense of regular life. You know what I
Yes.
mean? I
Mhm.
wasn't a magazine editor. I was a blogger like the other bloggers, and I had a family life. But what happened is a lot of the bloggers got consumed and they would
Mm.
work on the weekends and they do all the comments. And I can't even tell you how many of them got divorced, sadly, because they started putting their all into the blog. And so I'm a big believer, you need that family time. You
Yes.
need to dedicate it. And one of my regrets, and I will share a regret, is when I was working on Writing That Gets Noticed, it was due July, and my daughter was leaving for camp right around that period and graduating, I think it was, middle school. And I really checked out. I was not there for
Mhm.
it. And I do regret that. And I did apologize to my family for that. And I said, I will never, ever be in a position to do that again. And I'm very proud of the book. I'm very happy I did it. But it was a lesson for me, and it was a
Yeah.
lesson for my family in how I realized what I was missing. And I
Mhm.
really did miss a lot of those last few weeks before she left for camp. But she's forgiven me, and.
No, I think that's great advice. And what I would say about the out of office email is not only does it set expectations for everyone else, I think it sets expectations for you. And whenever I have that on, I always feel a greater permission and freedom, like there is more distance because you do have to take breaks. And, if you are a freelancer and you are working on a podcast and all of these other things that we do, I was telling someone the other day, if I wanted to, there is enough work that I could work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I could. I just
Good.
absolutely could, and I choose not to. So, all of my clients and students know I do not work on the weekend. That is set up in advance. I will take up to 48 hours to answer your question. There are very few emergencies. I have worked in a clinical setting. I know what an emergency is and what one is not. And also, I'm taking off most of the summer. I'm not working with clients over the summer, and I have an entire month that is a sabbatical month where, there will be an out of the office email and I will address things that are urgent. But,
Right.
I think it is important that we set those boundaries because I always think about two things. What Stephen King says in his book on writing, you don't put the desk in the center of the room. You put it against the wall because life needs to be in your center. And Frank Bedart, who is a poet that I met early in my writing life, he said, write some poems and then go live life. So you have to have all of that happening. Well, I want people
Yeah.
to buy your book. So
Thank
if
you.
people want to connect with you, what are the best ways? And please know that a link to your podcast is also going to be in the show notes. But what else is there?
Well, I'm on social media everywhere at Estelle S. Erasmus, S in the middle, and my name. And that's X, Instagram. Facebook professional is estelle.sobel.erasmus. And LinkedIn, I think it's Estelle Sobel Erasmus. I'm on TikTok. I share video clips from my podcasts and other things on TikTok. And my email, and I think that I said that earlier, freelance writing direct at
Yes.
gmail.com. And I love hearing from people. I'm happy. I love people coming to my Substack. And I just love sharing the information, the advice. I don't know when this is coming out, but I'm having an editor on call event with the deputy editor of The Cut, Jen Ortiz for NYU next week. So that's too soon. So
But
anyway,
they can look for the next time, right? If
Yes.
they're following you, I'm sure you'll do
Yes,
that
and they
again.
continue, right. I have an ongoing editor on call series that I do with NYU where I teach and where I received the Teaching Excellence Award last year. And I do occasional webinars with Writer's Digest. I teach there, and you can find all that information on my website and by signing up for my newsletter and my Substack. And I so appreciate speaking with you, Lisa. I'm such a fan of what you are doing with your podcast and how much you are helping people. And I'm a big believer in therapy as well. Big.
Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast and for all of your service that you offered so generously to our writing community. You really are a bright light out in our writing world and also in the world in general. You truly are. So thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you so much.
Are you a writer who struggles with doubts? Do you wonder if your stories are good enough? Do you wish you had some simple tricks that would make the writing life just a little bit easier? Become part of my Writing and Resilience community by signing up for my newsletter. As a thank you, you'll receive a free copy of Write More, Fret Less, 5 brain hacks that will supercharge your productivity, creativity, and confidence. The link is in the show notes. That's it for today's episode. Before you leave, I would love your help spreading the word about this podcast. You can do this in a few very simple ways. Click on the subscribe button in the upper right-hand corner, then leave a 5-star review. You can also let me know what you think or share ideas for the podcast by connecting with me on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, or through my Writing and Resilience newsletter, which you can have delivered directly to your inbox.